All right. We'll get started. We'll go ahead and open in prayer. Well, Father God, we thank you as always. Lord, you're such a perfect and glorious God. We thank you for the opportunity to gather here once again. We thank you for revealing your truth to us, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity to gather as believers and or just seekers, Lord, who are seeking to find out what your truth is, how we best understand the world that we live in, and how it makes the most sense, Lord God, based on the evidence that you will show to us and reveal to us. So we thank you for this time to gather. We ask you to bless our time, bless everyone who's come, and we thank you for just being our God and thanking you for all that you do in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we left off a few, points below the end last week. So if you still have notes from last week, we're looking at that. So this is all, we looked at that. Probably the most time we spent last week was on that, the introduction chapter, just kind of talking about the procedures and how to start evaluating things. And if you might recall, we talked about the authors are kind of taking this approach. I mean, they're not completely not using the word God or the Bible in the first introductory chapters, but really they're not trying to make any type of logical, rational, evidential case about the scriptures yet. All they're doing is talking about how can we understand as human beings, what methods do we use to understand the world that we live in, and ultimately it seems like the right, rational, correct way of thinking about things is to actually think about it as truth. Not just, I want to believe something, but it's important that what we believe is correct and it corresponds to reality. And so we picked up on that, and chapter 1 was just kind of this statement about, can we actually handle the truth? There's a lot of people out there. It's been going on for years. We live in what people might refer to as a post-truth society or culture that we live in today, where nobody wants to reveal or accept somebody else's truth. It's like truth is only what I will accept. And we talked about some of those, self-defeating statements that they point out in the book. If you've read through the book or you remember from last week, they kind of talked about, and they'll use this multiple times, this, quote, roadrunner tactic, where you simply just ask whether or not the claim that's being made stands on its own authority or can bear the weight of its own assertion, like there's no such thing as truth, which is immediately identified as a truth claim. And so if there's no such thing as truth, how can you say there's no such thing as truth? You're defeating your own purposes by making a statement about there's being no such thing as truth. So it's just kind of opening up. We'll jump in a little bit later tonight into some philosophical views, names you may have heard of, whether or not you've actually seen what they propose. It would be possibly a different factor. But anyway, let's finish up here. We're in this section on chapter 1. That ideas, including bad ones, have consequences. Yeah. I don't. Not with me right now. Sorry. I might be able to print some at the break if I can jump to that real quick, but unfortunately I don't right now. Okay. So, ideas have consequences, including if you have bad ideas, they have bad consequences or unfortunate consequences. So if there is no such thing as morality, we talked about this a little bit last week, but by review, why is it that someone would be upset when events happen in our lives, or we watch on TV, or we read in a newspaper, or read online? Why is it that anybody would be upset by something like mass murder, or robbery, or medical malpractice, or hate crimes, and all of these kind of things that you see people of all belief systems seem to just get really passionate about in some way or another? Why would it bother them if we're just a bunch of accidents walking around as water-filled bags of chemicals that were all just here by accident? Why do any of those things matter? And so some people take that to the extreme. And we've seen evidence of that in a great many of actually tens of millions of people being slaughtered and killed because they have zero value for human life. And we're talking about world dictators in the 20th century who have literally decided that certain people or certain classes of people have no value and are actually, it's better to exterminate them than to treat them as human beings. So all of these things have consequences, and we see that. So number 2, we send a disastrous message to society when we marginalize or demonize moral values using false or incorrect philosophies, and you'll see some of those tonight. So we continue to ask the question in the opening chapter of this book, can truth be known? And then you see that, I don't know if you've read the book, that there's that evangelism explosion example that Norm Geisler talks about that he had. And it's basically, anybody familiar with evangelism explosion? A few of you probably know it better than I. I've never actually practiced that. I've only read about it. But, basically it's ask, can I ask you a spiritual question? And then the second question is, they say yes to that, which most people do, is if you were to die today, where would you go? Or how certain are you what your destiny would be if you were to die today? And that kind of just has experientially helped open the door for people to have a conversation. And so there's a nice account of Norman Geisler in the book, the author of the book, co-author, having that conversation with a very hardened atheist, right? Walks up to the door and he starts wagging his finger and says, no, I don't want to have a conversation with you Christians or whatever you're selling. And this is just my quick summary recap of it. But, so Norm begins to ask, okay, well, so you're an atheist? And the guy says, well, yeah, I'm an atheist. And say, and he starts probing that question. Are you sure you're an atheist? So you really know what an atheist means, that you're saying there is no God. You're 100% certain there's no God. And he says, well, I don't know if I'm 100% certain there's no God. He says, well, then I guess you're more of an agnostic. And then he says, are you what was the terms he used? I can't remember now. Are you, a easy or a belligerent agnostic? Agnostic meaning, I don't know if there's such a thing as truth. I don't know. I don't make any claims towards it. He walks him through, and eventually he's like, no, I guess I'm kind of more of your average, non-aggressive agnostic. And he says, okay. And then they walk through the point, and then obviously the end of that story is that the guy they were having the conversation with ends up becoming a fully committed Christian, serving as a deacon or by a Sunday school teacher in his church and all of that. So again, if you haven't read the story, you do have the book. It's certainly a nice little account there of how that worked. But truth, can it be known? And so we saw that example of why it's important. So we actually would proclaim, I'll agree with the authors for certain here, that we think we can, in fact, as human beings, we've been given the capacity, the skills, the tools by which we can say, yes, there are such things as truth, and we can actually discover them so that we can use them. So we've talked about these super simple, statements of truth before. 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't matter if you're in America. It doesn't matter if you're in India. It doesn't matter if you're on the moon. It doesn't matter if you're in the Andromeda Galaxy. 2 + 2 = 4. It's a fundamental universal truth. The boiling point of water at sea level. You might be different at elevation changes and things like that, but it's one of these things. Is it testable? Is it repeatable? Does it happen the same way with the same conditions every single time? Laws of thermodynamics. We actually talk about scientific laws in some cases. And so I don't know what the criteria are for something to actually become a scientific law, but they have held to these scientific laws for quite some time. The first law, second law, third law of thermodynamics, and say, yes, we know what happens. And so we have some of that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about Einstein tonight, but most famous equation of all time is E = mc². But I didn't put the superscript, I guess, on there, but it's, if you don't know what that means, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared is a big equation there. And generally speaking, we've proven that to be law or fact. So just some points that most people are familiar with. So if truth can be known, there's some other laws that we can actually put into place. And again, this is a little bit of a review from where we started, but the law of non-contradiction, there's a law of logic called the law of non-contradiction, and it precludes the possibility that all religions can be true, or that any two contradictory truth claims can be true at the same time in the same sense. So if you have, let's say, two religious worldviews, and atheism and agnosticism and materialism and secular humanism are just as much a religion as is Christianity or Islam or Judaism or anything else, they all are religious beliefs. They are fervently held to, passionately defended, and they're based on faith, not evidence. All of them, right, in terms of some level. Now, I think some of them have far more evidence than others. fact, I think Christianity has the greatest evidence, and that's what this book and this class will help us to see. But they all have truth claims, and if there's a point where you say, well, this, you know, and you just take the basic one we even talked about last week, there is no God is one truth claim, and there is a God is another truth claim. There's no way you can make these two statements true at the same time and in the same sense. There either is or there's not. You can't get a middle ground, and you can't say that whatever you believe is true, because true for you, true for whatever, because there can't be, there isn't a God, but there is a God, and there is a God, and there's not a God. You just can't have that. Can't have contradictory claims about truth. Again, in the same time, in the same sense, you can't, it's always that qualifier there, because there can be things that would change over time, like, let's say, the boiling point of water. The boiling point of water at sea level is 212 degrees. But if you go up half a mile in the elevation, it's going to be different, right? And if you go try to boil water on the moon, it's probably going to be different. The same time, in the same sense, you say, okay, that's a truth. Okay, but in the same way, 2 + 2 is 4. No matter where you go, there's just no scenario by which 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. And they'll actually talk about that a little bit later in a couple of chapters deeper into the book. So then we talk about, or the authors talk about truth versus tolerance. Tolerance assumes that we are supposed to accept every belief as true. You might call it religious pluralism. Okay? Pluralism means all things. So tolerance, there's people say, you need to tolerate this, that, the other thing. My beliefs, my practices, what I believe. Well, they're saying, but I can't believe it, I can't accept it as true in the sense of religious pluralism. The same thing. There is no God, there is a God. These are, to say that somehow we can believe the same things at the same time is simply religious pluralism, and it ends up being just nonsensical. It's contradictory, doesn't make sense. In the same way, mutually exclusive beliefs cannot both be true. So attempting to accept or homogenize contradictory claims about God does in fact have eternal consequences, because there's some belief systems that would say there is a God and he created all things and he holds all people accountable for their conduct or their sins, and if we're wrong about how we are accountable to him, or what we could possibly do to be in relationship with him, or restored or forgiven from sins, if we're wrong about it, it has eternal consequences, right? So it seems really, really important to check these things out. In fact, whether you fall way over on one side of an extreme to say, you'll never find somebody who's more of an atheist than I am. I'm the greatest atheist that's ever lived, all the way up to, Paul, or somebody who's, a Christian who's just a Christian of Christians. They believe wholeheartedly in all these things. You cannot begin to try and homogenize these into one particular belief system. But what's the most important question we could possibly answer? If you're the most hardened atheist, how certain, how have you proven beyond all reasonable doubt that you will not be judged for your sins? Right? In the same way, how can a Christian demonstrate or prove through the evidence that we have available that all human beings will face judgment on a judgment day at some point in time in their future, or all of our futures? You have to be able to wrestle with those things. They can't be mutually exclusive claims. Certainly cannot be homogenized or reconciled, and so that seems to be super important, because if Christians are right, haven't gotten that far yet, but if Christians are right, this small little momentary blip that we live on this earth is so inconsequential to what eternity is, whether you spend it with God or separated from God. Super, super important. So if I were still an atheist, as I was for 27 years, having thought about these things a little bit more deeply than I ever did as an atheist, I would say, boy, I want to be right. I want to know for sure that I'm right, because if what those wacko Christians, what I would have called them at the time, say is true, then I better find out if I'm going to spend eons upon eons upon eons in torturous death, or get it right, So it's important. So religious pluralists who assert that people's religious views should not be questioned, like, hey, you have no right to step into my life and question what I believe or why I believe it. What we find in experience, you can probably back me up or back the authors up on this, that these people who say, we want to just tell everybody around us that you have no right to talk about religion to me, these people are just as close-minded and dogmatic as those who they're trying to silence when someone questions a religious view, right? They get dogmatic about it and say, no, you have no right to challenge my religious views. They're getting dogmatic. They're getting even religious, I might say, trying to thwart your attempts to have a conversation with them. Because ultimately, what most people do, and this is true of politics, it's true of religion, true of almost every controversial subject out there, most people just would be happy if everybody agreed with them. Right? We would be at such peace if just everybody agreed with me. Well, that's probably true, but that doesn't mean I should agree with you if you're wrong, if you have the wrong viewpoint. So, it is not. We have to come to a conclusion, regardless of our belief system and persuasions, it's not immoral to ask questions about religious beliefs of people. How tolerant is it to tell someone else not to question truth claims about God? Is that tolerant or intolerant? Say, no, you cannot ask me questions, or you cannot have conversations here about God. Is that tolerant or intolerant? It's intolerant, right? And so it's not immoral. It's actually one of the greatest tasks that anybody can have, is to actually solve the box top puzzle of life and say, this is what reality looks like. And the more we can discover it and find it, the better off everybody would be. So the Bible, when we bring the Bible back in this moment, the Bible commands Christian believers, to question religious beliefs. We're commanded to. It is our instruction to have a reasonable faith, to know what we believe and why we believe it, and to engage with anyone else along the way if we believe that we have been exposed to an actual truth that the world needs to hear. It's really incumbent upon us to do it. And if we actually believed it, if we truly, truly, truly believed that every human being has an eternal destiny in either heaven with God or hell in punishment, we would be very, very delicate. What am I going to say? No, I want to say something else. We would be derelict in our life, if we don't tell somebody about their eternal destiny, right, and the responsibilities that we have. This comes up all the time. Jesus commanded people not to judge. Is that true? No. He said don't judge hypocritically, right? He said don't be standing there with this great big sin hanging off of your own conduct and character and then run around telling somebody about their minor little teeny faults, right? He does command us to judge correctly, judge rightly, but we are not to judge hypocritically. We're not to make sure that somebody else feels the weight of our wrath and our judgment while we just simply live a life that's completely ungodly and immoral in our own conduct. So the issue is not whether we make judgments, but whether we make right judgments that are in line with God's standards. Again, this is just getting to that point. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, right. We have this visceral, knee-jerk reaction to somebody telling us we've done something wrong, or we're thinking wrong, or we're believing wrong, or whatever it may be. Most human beings have that push-back kind of attitude that says, I don't want to hear anything from you. All I want to receive from you is positive affirmations and love. The moment you tell me I'm doing something wrong, we're starting to get the stiff arm and, don't want to have a relationship with you in that. Shoot the messenger, exactly. Okay, so what cannot determine what is right or untrue is if we have no standard by which to judge truth or of right or wrong. We have to have a standard. There's got to be some objective standard for determining what is right and what is wrong. And many of you probably heard this analogy before. It's covered on page 49 of the I Don't Have Enough Faith book. But how many have heard the blind men trying to identify what an elephant is? Okay, some of you haven't. Okay, so the analogy is, I don't know if there's a specific number, but let's say you have 5 or 8 or 10 or whatever blind men, and you put them right in the presence of an elephant, and they're blind, and one's got the tail in his hand, and he says, oh, it feels like a twig or a reed or, something like that. And somebody else has got a foot and is like, well, it's like this stable, table or tree trunk or something like that. And somebody else has got the tusk, and, they're like, no, it's like this hard, it's almost like an enamel or a tooth, it feels like. All these people have got to come up, they have no idea. And so the point is, well, all religions lead to the same God. The Buddhists are over here grabbing the tail, and the Christians are over here grabbing the trunk of the elephant and all of that. And so they're all right. All religions are right. All roads lead to God. But we need to discover an objective standard. And so if we actually go from blind to sighted, we can stand back and look at the whole elephant and say, well, you're not wrong about the structure and characteristics of the tail or the trunk or the foot or the whatever, but you're not right about your description of what this elephant is. You need to step back and look at the whole thing and say, no, this is a complete animal, and its trunk looks like this, and its tusks look like this, and its ears look like this, and its feet look like this, right? That becomes the whole picture, and that's what we're saying is we need to have, it's not just, well, you're partially right, so you get credit and everybody goes to heaven. If we have to have the right picture, and so that kind of, again, stiff arm blocking of truth, saying, well, how could you possibly know that you're right and this other religion is wrong? Well, we have to be able to back up and say, is there an objective way to determine whether or not my view is the correct view, or if I need to change my view to make it the correct view? There's got to be something objective. There is an objective standard. There's something that defines what an elephant is biologically, and we can look at that and say, if you don't get the whole picture of it, if you don't describe what you're looking at, it's not a tree trunk or a twig and a branch, or it's not a palm branch fan for an ear. That's not what it is. It may feel like that, it may sense like that to you, but that's not what it is. It's actually an animal, a living, breathing animal that has all kinds of characteristics, and you're only partially describing one part of its body, and not fully correctly either way. So get that point. That's the whole blind men and the elephant analogy that's often used out there. Questions, comments, anything you want to talk about on that? That just kind of wraps up chapter 1. Okay, let's go to chapter 2. And here's where we're going to start talking about, okay, again, the progression of the book is just start talking about how most of the world who doesn't believe, doesn't have faith in God or Christ more specifically, how do we find out how they think, and how can we deal with those lines of rational thought or irrational thought and reasoning so that we can come to some categories about understanding the world that we live in. Okay, so they open up this chapter, and it's in a table format in the book, but it talks about these categories of belief. What causes any human being, rational thinking with a capacity to think, what causes anybody to think or believe something? Well, I think most of us would agree there are things like sociological reasons for people's belief system. We have parents that believe, so we believe like they do. We have friends, and this is usually what happens with people, or kids growing up, they believe what their parents believe, and then when they suddenly start to differentiate from their parents, and then they start believing what their friends believe, right? And then maybe the more they become socially aware, they start to believe what society believes on social media in today's culture, right? And they start to move in that. Well, I'll just adopt what somebody else has believed. They're not, most people, I think you would agree, most people are not out there at the Library of Congress looking up all of these philosophical systems and trying to come up with truth by themselves. In 2023, most attempts at communicating truth are done in a meme. You got a little picture, you got a little blurb, and people go, okay, it sounds good to me. And they move on. It's not a reasoned, rational, educated attempt to understand truth. It's just, well, okay, I believe what these people that I like well enough to agree with their viewpoint, I'll agree with them. So that's sociological. There's also physiological. I want comfort. I mean, my greatest desire in life is to live a comfortable life, and that means I need money, I need a bank account, I need a place on the beach, I need whatever. And so whatever helps me get that comfort level I want, that's my belief system. Right? I'm looking for something to get from it, and so these physiological responses is what makes up my belief system. Peace of mind, meaning, purpose, hope, my own true identity. All of these things people will adopt as a belief system, but again, generally without a lot of thought process going into how did I get to that belief system. It's just, well, it's a means to an end to get me where I want to be physiologically. Religious, and so people will certainly turn to Scripture, or they'll trust their pastor. Well, if he believes it, it's good enough for me. Or their guru, or the rabbi, or the imam, or whatever the church statements of faith are, or whatever it is. They might go that far. I'll believe what they believe, but I don't want to think so deeply that I have to actually, again, investigate these truth claims for myself. I'll just take some trusted leader in that area and believe what they say. Philosophical, and looking for, it gets a little bit deeper, takes a little bit more work, but in a philosophical sense, you're going to look for consistency. Does the world that I live in seem to match this philosophical view that I'm either constructing on my own or picking up from somebody else who has thought philosophically about the world we live in? But they should maintain some level of consistency. I look at the world, I look at the philosophical viewpoint, and yeah, they seem to match up nicely. That seems to work well. So they should be coherent. As you'll see, we don't have a lot of coherency in the couple of guys we'll talk about in a moment. Or what is the best explanation for the world that we live in. So, we've looked at this a little bit last week as well, but an apologist, someone who we move from these, I got influenced into my beliefs into becoming an apologist, someone who can show good reason and evidence to support or contradict a particular belief. Now that's where you start to actually advance into something where I have to take personal responsibility to say, well, I want to be an apologist. I want to both defend my own views and then show others when those critical questions and those objections come along. I want to be able to say, no, there's a reason why I believe what I believe. So it advances up a level of responsibility and usually a level of effort to get there. So there's a couple of points under that. A teaching is only worth trusting if it points to the truth. That would seem to make sense, that I'm going to trust this teaching from a book or from a teacher or a pastor or scientist or whatever it may be, but only if it actually points to the truth. If it doesn't point to the truth, then you might as well believe anything you want, because it doesn't really matter. You're not looking for truth. Apathy, meaning I have no care or concerns about truth, can be dangerous in this life, and of course, as we mentioned a moment ago, in the life to come. If we're apathetic towards truth, it could have very disastrous consequences. So many, you might even say most, beliefs people hold cannot be supported by evidence. I want to just let that sink in for a moment. Most beliefs that people have cannot be supported by the evidence. Now you say, oh, well, we're here in a Christian church and we're all Christians, and so is that true? Is that true for us? Most people's beliefs cannot be supported by their evidence. I can give you some statistics on that for us Christians and say, the statistics are pretty solid. Only 6% of Christians have a biblical worldview. So generally speaking, most people's beliefs aren't supported by the evidence. And that's true of all belief systems. Conversely, truth is not a matter of subjective preference. It's a matter of objective fact. I hope no one is a Christian because it feels good or you get, some type of accolades from your people you live with or you're friends with or whatever it may be. Hopefully, it's not a matter of subjective, I like it, so I'll take it, or I like this kind of claim. Hopefully, it's really a matter of looking at facts objectively and saying, this matches with reality. Like we said, the authors here are using this analogy of the box top of a puzzle and saying, the puzzle that I put together actually matches the world of the picture of what I'm supposed to match. If I get something that looks completely different, then my reality doesn't match the objective standard of reality of what the puzzle was supposed to look like when I was done. So, facts, for this statement that's always out there, we don't, when it comes to truth, we don't invent truth, we only discover truth. Now, obviously, we can make choices. You made a choice to be here in class tonight, and so the fact is you're here, that's true. So you participated in that fact, but we only can discover, especially when we're talking about the big questions of life, we don't invent truth, we discover truth. Okay? We don't discover the boiling point, or we don't decide, I want to make the boiling point of water 212 degrees at sea level. You go out there and you find out what is the boiling point of water at sea level, and you say, lo and behold, every single time it starts boiling at 212 degrees. We discover that truth. We don't invent the truth or influence the outcome of truth in that way. So truth is truth, no matter where you come from or what you believe. Doesn't matter if you're from America, doesn't matter if you're from Russia, doesn't matter if you're from Africa, it doesn't matter if you're from India. Truth is truth, no matter where you come from or what you believe. In contrary claims to the truth itself, truth is always truth, independent of the person thinking about truth. All right, so I know that's all just kind of, let's get started. That's a little bit not the most exciting part of this whole thing. Let's talk about what is a little bit more moving towards some of these things. How can we, as rational thinking human beings, kind of starting with a clean slate, how can we begin to follow some rules of logic or rules of rational thought and reasoning to come to an understanding of the world that we live in? Well, let's talk about some of these. The rules of logic, and this is on page 56. Either or, okay? There's only two choices in most of these attempts to define actual statements of truth. I'm either alive or I'm dead. You're either alive or you're dead. Okay, and so that gets into this excluded middle. I can't be both dead and both alive, and I can't be partially dead and partially alive, and these kind of things. You're either biologically, medically, technically alive, or they say the time of death is this, and you're dead. Okay, you're pregnant or you're not pregnant, right? There's just not really an in-between. For the women who could be pregnant, right? You're either that or you're not. You're either married or you're not. Doesn't matter if you're going through to get married or you're going through to get unmarried. You're either married or you're not. You have this document that says either you're joined in matrimony to another person, or you have a document or lack thereof that says am not married to somebody, right? You either are or you're not. And there's just all these things. And so it's either or. You can't have, it talks about the excluded middle. You can't have these sort of quasi-claims to truth. And you can think about all those things. Just like we talked about last week and then a few moments ago, there either is a God or there's not a God. You can't have a partial God. You can't say, well, the world has God for people who believe in him, but for people who don't believe in God, there is no God. That's not logical. Okay. The law of non-contradiction is self-evident. There needs to be no validation. Everybody knows you can't have a contradiction. You can't say, I'm dead and I'm alive. These are two contradictory claims. It's just thinking about logic and reason in such a way that we can understand it. And what becomes important is the opposite of true is false. Okay. So in this whole scenario, you can say, I'm not married. Okay, all right, and so that means you can't say, there's no way I can say, well, therefore you must be married, right? Or the opposite of true is false. So if somebody says, are you married? Then you can say, then that means you cannot possibly not be married. Okay, if it's the opposite of what we just claimed here, I'm married, then the opposite can't be true. The opposite is false. Okay. So here's this extreme example again. There's some really comical parts of this book if you read it. They have this quote from Avincia. Not sure if that's the right way to pronounce it. He says this about these, kind of thinking about these rules of logic. Anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until they confess that not being beaten or burned is not the same thing as being beaten or burned, right? You get what he's saying, right? He's saying don't be contradictory, right? Being burned or beaten is not the same thing as not experiencing being burned and beaten. They're very different things. And people who believe that, all truths are true, or all truth claims are true, right? Here's a guy who's like, I'm so frustrated with you people who won't claim that there's truth in the world, is saying, look, if you walk up to me and you say, I don't believe there's such thing, I think there can be contradictory truth claims, well, then you should be beaten and burned until you agree with me that it's different to be burned and beaten than it is to not be burned or beaten. Okay. I wouldn't make quite such a claim, but you get the point, right? There are contradictory statements that need to be dealt with, and illogical statements should be refuted. Okay, so how many have heard of David Hume? How many have heard of Immanuel Kant? Okay. Those of you who raised your hand, can you explain their kind of philosophical statements particularly well? Okay. Most of us, some of us have heard, not all, so some of us have heard of some very, very, very influential philosophers from centuries past. David Hume and Immanuel Kant. So Hume, the discussion of him starts on page 57. And according to David Hume's theory, he says this, okay, all meaningful ideas are true by definition or are based on senses. Okay. True by definition. Like we talked about this last week, water is wet. Okay. Water is wet is true by definition. Don't need any proof claims or any ways of proving that water is wet. It's just true by definition. Or it's based on senses, right? Fire is hot. I put my hand in the fire, I get burned, okay? I've got senses that help me to evaluate the truth that fire burns people or fire is hot. Okay? So he says, the important point here is all, right? All meaningful ideas are true by definition or based on the senses. Anything beyond the physical should not be believed, is his claim. Anything beyond the physical is not to be believed as any kind of truth claim. So anything that's not physical should not be believed. So he claims this. So verifiable abstract reasoning such as math, 2 + 2 is 4, 10 divided by 2 is 5, whatever, right? It's verifiable by abstract reasoning. And it should be empirically verifiable through our senses. See, these are the way he's trying to evaluate the world that we live in. But you'll notice pretty quickly here, he's doing all he can to exclude the possibility of God in his philosophical view. Because it has to be verifiable or, true by definition in the sense of what human beings can sense. Okay. So he says, anything that does not fit this system from David Hume should be burned because it contains nothing but sophistry or illusion, right? So he wants to take, I don't know, I probably didn't bring a Bible. Well, I did. No, I didn't. Good. So his point, like I said, is really clear. Everything is true because it is either objectively true, needs no proof whatsoever, or we can sense it. And so he says, look, anything that doesn't fit my definition, such as this book or really any other book that I have up here, should be burned because it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. Okay. And then A.J. Ayer went along and added to this viewpoint a little bit, talking about true by definition or empirically verifiable out there on page 58. So, Dr. Geisler is on page 58. Or page 59. This might be my favorite part of the whole book. For those of you who read it, maybe you know what I'm talking about here. So on page 59, he goes through this whole example where he, as a student, was given a class to talk about this whole thing. And let me see if I can find it. Is that right? Okay. So, oh no, that was the teaching one. Okay, sorry. All right, so it says this. So on page, actually it's page 57. I think I wrote it down wrong. So on page 57, let me just read a couple sections here. It says, on the first day of class, this professor gave the class the task of giving presentations based on chapters in Ayer's book, Logic, Truth, and Language. I volunteered to do the chapter titled, The Principle of Empirical Verifiability. Now, keep in mind that the principle of this was the very foundation of this logical positivism class he was in. It was a part of the entire course. So at the beginning of the next class, the professor said, Mr. Geisler, we'll hear from you first. Keep it to no more than 20 minutes so we can have time for discussion. Well, since I was using the lightning-fast roadrunner tactic, I had absolutely no trouble with the time constraints. I stood up and simply said, the principle of empirical verifiability states that there are only two kinds of meaningful propositions. One, that they are true by definition, and two, that they are empirically verifiable. Since the principle of empirical verifiability itself is neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable, it cannot be meaningful. That was it, and I sat down. There was a stunned silence in the room. Most of the students could see the coyote dangling in midair. They recognized the principle that of empirical verifiability could not be meaningful based on its own standard. It self-destructed in midair. In just the second class period, the foundation of the entire class had been destroyed. What was the professor going to talk about for the next 14 weeks? Right? You get the point. No, there's no such thing as truth. Is that true? Right? Same thing. If the claim that the only truth is empirically verifiable, it's true by definition, and this truth claim that truth can only be known by empirical verifiability or by its own definition is itself not unverifiable by its own system, and threw it out. Right? I mean, I would love to have been in the class, Dr. Geisler, making that statement. All right. So you get the point. They're trying, basically, the attempt at David Hume and Ayer here is to get God out of people's minds. Stop thinking about God. I want you not to believe in God. And so they come up with philosophical systems to convince people there's no reason to think that God exists. All right, so I moved on from that. Okay. Number 5, so the response here is the claim that something can only be meaningful and empirically verifiable, true by definition, excludes itself. I read all that. All right. So then we move on to Immanuel Kant. So we start with David Hume. I think that was in the 1700s, right? And then if Kant's philosophy is right, okay, then there's no way to know anything in the real world empirically verifiable according to Kant. So what is Kant trying to do? Immanuel Kant, he says this. Our mind forms the image, and he used the example of a tree, okay, rather than the image imprinting on our mind based on its inherent objective attributes. So, if you haven't read the book or still weren't clear on this, he says, look, if you're looking out the window and you see this tree out there in the grass out here right outside the window, and you see it blowing in the breeze and you're looking at it and you're going, well, I see it has a trunk and it has branches and it has leaves and it's green and it has all these characteristics. He's saying you can't trust anything that you just said. You can't trust it. Your eyes could lie to you. And so you have no connection to truth because you can't see truth. You can't accept truth. It might be lying to you. What has happened, according to Kant, was your mind just made up an image. That tree may not even be there. Your mind just envisioned, well, gosh, suddenly today I wanted to see a tree and to have these characteristics, and so my mind just put it there. It doesn't exist. That's a really dangerous world to live in, isn't it? Is that semi-truck there that I'm going to walk in front of, or is it just a figment of my imagination? Right? It's a really dangerous, dangerous world to live in, but people will do anything to excuse God out of their existence. So Kant says you can only know anything based on how your mind interprets what it perceives, and your mind can't be trusted to know what it perceives, so Kant's conclusion is you can't know anything. Your mind will lie to you. You can't trust your mind. Of all of your senses, 5 or more senses you have, you can't trust any of them. So you can't know anything. He's spent his whole life saying that, and he was a respected professor, well quoted, well known. Immanuel Kant's name is known for many, many centuries now, and people still quote him extensively. Well, right. How can he know he's truth? Because he feels very comfortable with his conclusions. That's the flaw in his argument. Right. Again, once again, it's self-defeating. He can't get there from here. Yeah, Bill. Yeah. Right. Did God really say? Yeah, the devil loves those kind of people questioning. So you see, these are two examples of, again, if you haven't taken philosophy, this is if you don't know these names, it doesn't mean anything about you. But if you ask anybody who's ever studied philosophy, I guarantee you they've heard of Immanuel Kant and David Hume. Okay, what do they do? What are they trying to conclude? That they are starting out with a purposed and intentional desire to remove God from their existence. And so they created a philosophical way to look at the world that says there doesn't need to be a God because I've proven him by my own cellular brain power to say there is no such thing as God. Or logic, or reason, or, you can't know anything. You can't know if you're married. You can't know if you had dinner last night. You can't know anything, okay, because your senses could be lying to you. So he even says this, there's an unbridgeable gap between the real world and the mind. Thus, there are no truths about the real world. Is that a system you want to sign up for? Okay. But again, here we go back to Roadrunner logic stuff. Are his views actually true? Do they correspond to reality? So there's this nothing but fallacy that we see in Kant's argument. Nothing but implies more than knowledge. This is how he gets around. This is how he claims. He claims to have this superior knowledge, this more than knowledge. I figured out the world. You can't know anything about the world, but the only thing I can know at all is you can't know anything about the world. Okay, I've got this superior knowledge. It's kind of Gnosticism of his day. Kant knows, if you will, the data in his brain receives nothing but just phenomena. He knows it. He's understood it. He's so enlightened. The rest of us just need to catch up with his enlightenment because he just knows it. Because he just knows it. He's superior. He's got this superior knowledge. And us plebeians will eventually get there if we just accept his reality. Okay. Right. So, but in order for him to know what he makes his claim, he would have to see more than the phenomena itself. He has to be outside of his own existence to see that his truth claim is actually corresponding to the reality he's attempting to articulate here. So he's using this nothing but fallacy, meaning there is no such thing as truth except the one truth that I have elevated over everything else. Okay. So in order to distinguish between the real world and what his or any of our minds perceive, he would have to be able to see both the real world, which could be knowable, and his own image of the real world, which only he knows. But this is exactly what he's claiming he can't do. He's claiming you can't know the real world, but in the same time saying, I figured out the real world. It looks like this. Okay? So he's just patting himself on the back and saying, I'm so much smarter and philosophically more astute than everybody else in the world. I figured out that you can't know reality except the reality that I have articulated. Because this approach, you agree, this approach makes no sense. It's self-defeating. It uses a logical fallacy, and it simply does not reflect or correspond to the reality that most of the world lives in. We don't sit there and look at a tree out the window and go, is that real? Is my mind lying to me? I might say, is somebody pulling a trick on me? Are they trying to do an optical illusion and trick me into thinking something? But most of us don't look at trees and cars and buses and people and go, I don't know, maybe it's just not, maybe it's just my mind making stuff up. Okay. His philosophy, I think, is properly rejected. We can't look at the world through the lens of this Hume or Kant philosophy. Instead, would you not agree, it's also much more logical to acknowledge that what we see and perceive, is actually an accurate representation of reality. We look around, we see colors, we see lights, we see objects, we see things in our world, and they probably, in almost all cases, actually represent themselves accurately to our senses. Seems like the best way to go. But as he says here, that's what happens when a beautiful theory mutes a brutal gang of facts. So Kant and Hume's theories, they're just beautiful. Cover whiteboards with them, and people can go, wow, how did you come up with that incredible thing? And then the brutal gang of thugs walks in and says, that doesn't match reality. Facts are facts, right? So you see that on page 61. So truth exists as I think we can make a claim that truth actually exists. It is absolute and it's undeniable. Hume and Kant are simply wrong in their philosophical views of the world. To say that truth cannot be known is a self-defeating claim. There's no such thing as truth, or truth is unknowable. What are we doing once again? Making a truth claim that we cannot be supported by its own assertion. So they're both wrong based on their own attempts to make a statement about facts. So let's get into away from Kant and Hume and whatever disastrous attempts to be philosophical that they are, and start looking at, well, how do you actually discover truth? So we get back to this. Law of non-contradiction. Most of us really realize that you cannot have something that's true in the same sense at the same time, because that would be a contradiction, and we can't live in a world with contradictions. And then we get to the law of the excluded middle. Something is, it exists, or it is not, does not exist. There is no compromised middle position between existence and non-existence. Existence of God, existence of mankind, existence of marriage, existence of mathematics. There is no such thing as like, well, there's something that we can just play with the middle between here. So generally speaking, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to read the Bible. These are well-established laws of logic and reason. You cannot have a contradiction. You cannot have something in the middle between two truth claims. Like these kind of things, right? Either you received a raise or you didn't. Doesn't matter if it's a penny. Doesn't matter if it's something. Either you received a raise at your employer or you didn't. Either a person is alive or dead. Either God exists or he doesn't. We begin to see you can't have something in the middle between those two positions. So without these first principles of logic, discovering any truth would be impossible. Thank God he's given us rational ways of looking at the world. Okay? We cannot have contradictions. We cannot have this excluded middle. And the opposite of true is false. So that helps us do it. So here's an example. I try to gather you back in here for a moment, because I know this is all this philosophical stuff. Just everything we always wanted to do in life is study philosophies that aren't actually real, right? Let's look at how we can actually evaluate the world that we live in. So we use these like soliloquies, I think they're called, or whatever, right? So it starts off with these two premises. Usually this is kind of the minimum level of trying to deal with truth claims, okay? There's a premise, such as, all men are mortal. It's a premise. It's not a fact. It's a premise, okay? That you can go off and try to prove the premise on a separate soliloquy or a truth, that, a logical truth claim, but syllogism, yeah, thank you, sorry. All men are mortal, okay? So if you accept that fact, then we can move on to the second one. Spencer, whoever that might be, is a man, okay? So if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then the conclusion is the only logical, rational way of looking at the world. Spencer must be mortal. Okay. Now, if all men aren't mortal, then that may not be true. If Spencer isn't a man, then it's certainly not true. But if premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true, then the conclusion that we draw from that is true. This is the basic reality of understanding all truth. All of it that we can possibly begin to understand. So again, the logical conclusion follows from the two premise. Logic does not address the truth claim of these first two premise statements, but the conclusion is valid and leaves no other logical option, right? If all men are mortal and Spencer is a man, then what other conclusion can you come to? Spencer's immortal? How do you do that? All men are mortal and Spencer is a man. You can't get to, well, he must be immortal. You can't get to something else. Spencer doesn't exist. Spencer never lived in the first place. No, you just said Spencer's a man. So the only way to get to the conclusion is to say, if the premises are true, the conclusion naturally flows from that statement. Okay. So whether you've ever thought about it before in your entire life, that's how we process information. Okay. We have premises, and we come to conclusions based on evidences. So the premise statements 1 and 2 must be evaluated from observation and drawing, general conclusions, which are, we'll say, beyond a reasonable doubt. It's impossible for us mortal human beings to get to 100% certainty on every attempted proposition. Okay? This is known as inductive reasoning. I don't know if you've heard that term before. Inductive reasoning. You're coming to a point of understanding through induction, meaning letting the evidence reveal itself to us. Okay? That's on page 63. So the conclusion here, all men are mortal, cannot be perfect, since no person can observe the mortality of every person who's ever lived. Right? We can't go and investigate even the 8 billion people that are alive today on our planet, but we can't go back in history and observe the life and death of every single human being from Adam and Eve all the way to us and go, see, I've watched. Every single person dies. But might we feel like we're pretty darn comfortable making a statement that every human being dies. Therefore, every human being is mortal. Okay, we would probably feel pretty comfortable that that captures, beyond a reasonable doubt, the world that we live in, a true reality of the world that we live in. People die. No one escapes death. Okay? So if we got to 99% reality here, then that left less than 1%, even if there's some space for doubt, it would never erase the reasonable doubt threshold. Okay? We've proven beyond a reasonable doubt that all men are mortal. Now, we can go through and medically or biologically or some other way prove that one of us is a man or a human being, then I think we can conclude we're going to die. Because all the evidence says two things. All people die, and I'm a person. That's how logic, reason, rational works. So, how are truths about God known? That's how we just get general truths about the life and the world that we live in. How could we know truth about God? That seems even more challenging. Well, once again, observation and inductive reasoning, just with any other truth claim. If we're going to understand, does God exist? Is there really a God who's up there in the heavens or wherever he is somewhere? The only way to know beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists is by observation of the world that we live in and inductive reasoning, rational conclusion based on the evidence. That's what I'm asking. That's what the authors are asking. We're going to say, does God exist? It's not a blind faith. It's a rational response to the observable evidence using rational, reasoning techniques to get there. So, we must, as it's incumbent upon us as human beings, we must observe the effects and come to a rational, reasonable conclusion about the presumed cause that produced the resulting effect. What does it mean? Most of us recognize, and most 3-year-olds and above recognize that we live in a cause and effect world. The universe, everything we have, we see, we see an explosion at the building next door. We say, I wonder what caused that explosion. Right? We just believe that something caused the effect. We see it all the time, right? Nobody walks up to, somebody walks in the door of the church and we don't go, gosh, did you just crawl out of the primordial goo and walk into the church, or do we assume Well, you had parents that brought you into this world. There's a cause and an effect. I'm an effect. My parents are the cause, with God involved as well, to bring me into the world. So we live in this cause and effect world. We begin to think rationally and properly about the world we live in, recognizing that every effect had a preceding cause. Such as, all books have one. Here's another syllogism. What is it called, Bill? Syllogism? Yeah, I always mess that up. All right. All books have at least one author. That's the premise. Okay? Based on inductive investigation. I walk into any library and I start picking up books and I go, oh, well, there's the author's name. And I pick up another book and I go, oh, there's the author's name. Oh, every time I pick up a book, I seem to find an author associated with the book. So my inductive investigation of the evidence available to me says all books have an author. Okay? And then I pick up our text for this class and I go, well, here's a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Okay, I've got it right here in my hand. So I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist is a book. Seems to match any other kind of definition of a book that I've ever seen. Therefore, we can rationally conclude that this book had at least one author. We don't need to know. We don't have to watch them type it into their computer to know that they were actually the author. We just know that all books have authors. This is a book. Therefore, the book that in question must have had an author. Again, seems so logical, so unlike Kant and Hume. So the big question for all of us is, are there any observable effects that seem to require some kind of pre-existing supernatural intelligence in the world that we live in? The answer is yes. The universe is an effect that requires a pre-existing supernatural intelligence to have caused it. Okay. We'll take a break. We'll get back and talking about how can we support that claim. The claim that the evidence that we see in the world that we live in requires supernatural power, supernatural intelligence to have brought the universe into existence. We'll talk about that in a moment. So take 5 and we'll come back.